David Hume is, without doubt, one of the most influential philosophers for our modern era. He revolutionized and reinvigorated empiricism, clearly defined the problem of induction, and formally questioned our belief in causality. Even Kant, an arguably more influential thinker, credits David Hume with awakening him from his own dogmatic slumber. He's one of my favorites. But in his book, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, arguably his mature magnum opus, he makes a mistake that would make any professor of philosophy cringe if a student turned in an essay with a similar inclusion. It's a mistake that makes nearly everyone reading the book pause and balk at the boldness of it. At the risk of being just as bold as Hume, if you like explorations of this sort, I would heavily encourage a subscription to my channel. I always do my best to bring stimulating, challenging videos to my viewers. Anyways, in An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume outlines his skeptical epistemology and his rejection of the baseless metaphysical speculation prevalent at his time. To do that, he begins by rejecting innate ideas. For Hume, all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and experience. Any idea or thought we ever have is founded upon some sense impression. If we think of a golden mountain, Hume says this isn't a priori knowledge, it's a combination of previous sensory impressions of the color gold and a physical mountain. This was important in his time because it combated the reign of rationalist metaphysics at the time, or schools of thought that asserted truth of the world could be arrived at through pure, rational speculation completely removed from empirical reality. Like, as if the laws of physics could have been ascertained by some really smart guy locked in a box for his whole life. For Hume, this is ridiculous, because the guy locked in the box would have very little access to the necessary experience needed to even begin doing physics. He rejects a priori knowledge about the world, or factual truths fully independent of existence, and says all knowledge of this sort is a posteriori, or after experience. In his very famous passage, he says, "If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." For him, manipulating abstract objects can yield its own kind of truth, like mathematical truth within some kind of axiomatic system. Regarding matters of fact, or what there actually is in the world, speculation must be grounded on experimental or empirical data, and is completely useless otherwise. This is known as Hume's fork. You can know truths concerning relations between ideas a priori, like in math, since they are purely conceptual truths, but concerning matters of fact, there is no truth independent of experience, or a priori. His argument is relatively simple and rests on two basic premises. First, when we analyze our thoughts or ideas, however compounded or sublime, we always find that they resolve themselves into such simple ideas as were copied from a precedent feeling or sentiment. Basically, if you look at any idea you have, it is definitely grounded on sensory impressions or perceptions. This is known as Hume's copy principle. He gives even the idea of God as being based on the unlimited augmentation of our impressions of human qualities of intelligence and goodness. Secondly, if it happen from a defect of the organ that a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation, we always find that he is as little susceptible of the correspondent ideas. A blind man can form no notion of colors, a deaf man of sounds. One cannot possibly conceive of something if it hasn't previously been encountered in the world in its most simple form. Thus, rationalism makes no sense because we can form no concept of something if we lack the initial sensory impression. Hume gives a very straightforward way to refute his own position. saying, "Those who would assert that this position is not universally true, nor without exception, have only one, and that an easy method of refuting it, by producing that idea which, in their opinion, is not derived from this source." Basically, Hume challenges the reader to think of any single idea that isn't founded on some artifact of experience, and you will have thus disproven him. It's basically proof by counterexample. He asserts his position is universally true, that every idea we have is founded on empirical experience, argues for that position, and says that even one example to the contrary will show him to be wrong. Here is where he makes his fatal mistake, or so it seems at first. Perhaps in an attempt to preemptively block criticism, Hume says this: "There is, however, one contradictory phenomenon, which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for ideas to arise, independent of their correspondent impression. Suppose, therefore, a person to have enjoyed his sight for 30 years, and to have become perfectly acquainted with colors of all kinds, except one particular shade of blue, for instance, which it has never been his fortune to meet with. Let all the different shades of that color, except that single one, be placed before him, descending gradually from the deepest to the lightest. It is plain that he will perceive a blank where that shade is wanting. Now I ask, whether it be possible for him, from his own imagination, to supply this deficiency, and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses? I believe there are few but will be of opinion that he can, and this may serve as a proof that the simple ideas are not always, in every instance, derived from the correspondent impressions, though this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. Geez. To paraphrase, he is basically saying that if someone has never seen one particular shade of blue, and someone showed him, in a kind of sequence, all the shades of blue except for that very particular one with a gap where it should be, that the viewer would likely be able to fill in that gap, thus exhibiting an instance where a simple idea of something, the shade of blue the subject had never seen, can be obtained where there is no corresponding empirical impression. You have the idea of that shade of blue, but you've never seen that shade of blue. And he says, in the end, that it's basically such a small example that it doesn't really matter and shouldn't affect the generality of his assertion that all ideas are derived from experience. To summarize, here is Hume's argument in 4 points. 1. All ideas are derived from experience. 2. To disprove this, one must provide a counterexample. 3. Here is a counterexample. 4. It is an unimportant counterexample, so it doesn't actually disprove that all ideas are derived from experience. Yikes. Charitably, Hume appears to be saying that, as far as meaningful metaphysical speculation and physical science goes, the example is so minute that it won't really give much room for the rationalists to reassert themselves. Like, sure, in this very specific example, a person may get some a priori knowledge about the world, but that doesn't mean your insane a priori rationalist metaphysical system is valid at all. While this may be true, it would take a lot more robust of an argument than he makes to justify that, and as it stands, this admission of a counterexample seems quite damning. Whether or not it has implications for the truth of the rest of his system, which I believe it does if you accept this counterexample, it's still a tough mistake. Like, within a page or two, he says all you need is a counterexample to show he's wrong, gives a counterexample, then just minimizes it rather than addressing it in a thoughtful way. It's an embarrassing mistake, to be sure, but is it one that Hume really had to make? Is this truly an example of true a priori knowledge about the empirical world? My goal here is to make an argument that the situation Hume outlined above is actually perfectly compatible with the empirical system he put forth. I want to argue that the situation above doesn't really violate the copy principle. I don't think they get the shade of blue out of thin a priori air. They interpolate between the other shades of blue, previous sensory impressions, exactly what the copy principle sets forth. So, let's return to the situation. A person has seen every shade of blue save for one, and when all of them are displayed in sequence, the person will be able to fill in the gap. Shades of blue are, in physics, derived from specific wavelengths of light. These wavelengths are assessed as numbers of the real number line. Let's say the entire spectrum of blue ranges from 1 and 2 on the real line, just for representational sake. In real life, the wavelengths of light for blue are about 450 nanometers to 485 nanometers, but here 1 and 2 because they are easy. Let's say the wavelength the person hasn't seen is 1.5 exactly, but they've seen everything around it, ignoring some difficulties with open sets here. As Hume said earlier, all our ideas are based on compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing. Surely addition, multiplication, division, and subtraction fall under the umbrellas of augmentation and diminishment. And for any wavelength between 1 and 2, we can always get to 1.5 by those operations of addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division. For example, if we've seen wavelengths up to 1.4 and we want to conceptualize 1.5, perhaps we can add 0.1. Even if we are only able to work with numbers between 1 and 2, we can simply add 1.3 to 1.4, then subtract 1.2, yielding us a sum of 1.4 plus 0.1, giving us 1.5. Hume himself seems to admit that this kind of augmentation is possible. His example of God shows this. The idea of God as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom. Just multiply or add more and more intelligence and goodness and you get something infinitely good and intelligent. It's a very similar operation to our blue example and is totally consistent. And remember, the person above has seen every single wavelength of blue except for the very specific one. They have seen blue shade 1.4999 repeating and 1.500001 or whatever. All it takes is a simple interpolation between those two. To make this a bit more concrete, when we have seen every shade of blue, which in physics are shown to be numerically designated wavelengths of light, perhaps the copy principle through augmentation and diminishment allows us to perform pseudo-mathematical operations to get that wavelength of light we haven't seen. But this relies on the idea that we can do this kind of mental arithmetic with the visual representations of spectra. If we saw two bridges of varying lengths, we may be able to imagine the mathematical midpoint in the above fashion because length is a spatial dimension that we are very capable of intuitively conceptualizing mathematically. But it may not be convincing to you that just because we can arrive at specific wavelengths through this kind of mathematical operation, that we can do something analogous with the actual shades of blue that we conceptualize. We obviously don't see colors as numbers in our head, I can't stress that enough. Nor is there a clear, intuitive, heuristic mapping to numeric qualities like bridge lengths can have. And it's tough to directly confirm that we can perform these operations with color with empirical experience, because most people have seen enough colors to where it's really hard to say if they are genuinely augmenting or diminishing colors to create a new one, or just remembering one they have already seen, if that can even be ascertained in theory, because what if someone has seen a color that they then forgot, like a dark shade of blue, and then genuinely darkened blue in their head to get the one they previously forgot? Does that count? Maybe not. It's very hard to say for sure. For me, the reason I tend to think it's not a true counterexample is because of the potential difference of subject. The person in the scenario has already seen every single other shade of blue. Could a blind person who has never seen any color conceptualize that shade? Hume had already acknowledged that the born blind have no concept of color. If they have never seen any color, much less any shades of blue, they simply can never ever come up with the missing shade. But once you've seen color, and it may be to varying degrees, you gain the potential ability to generate new variations of colors. Just that mere fact shows that the ability to generate the shade of blue relies on some experience. You must be exposed to color to some unknown extent to be able to fill in that gap. Could it be that the distinct shades of colors aren't necessarily the simple phenomena that Hume thinks they are, as in, through a kind of nebulous function, a certain level of exposure to varying colors and shades is the simple phenomena that allows you to then start mixing and augmenting, for the copy principle to then apply. Like, seeing one wavelength of blue in your life won't really allow you to do much in terms of augmentation or diminishment. You may just be stuck with that shade of blue. But then, if you've seen black and white, and maybe a shade of red or green, you can start darkening and brightening, or mixing to get cyan and yellow and purple. But if you have never seen any of these, you'll never get to those shades or those colors because you lack anything to start with. I think we learn to experience color as a kind of gradient or spectrum, which only aids in the subject's ability to perform an interpolation. We may not numerically demarcate every wavelength of light, but there is a sense of proximity between colors, which makes it much more sensible for the subject to then perform the operations of the copy principle. Like, blue and purple may not have numerical designations in our head, but we see them as close in a sense, and violet is between them. This is true especially for the subject as Hume presents it, who is explicitly shown the shades of blue in a type of order. It's not crazy that they then can fill in a gap, because we slowly learn to see a structure for color, and then adding to that structure makes sense. The structure may not be as definite or sophisticated as the real number line and wavelengths, but it's there nonetheless. This is why I think the situation as Hume states it isn't an example of an idea arrived at a priori, without an attached sensory impression. If we had that ability, a blind person would be able to come up with that shade, but they can't. They don't have the basic structure of color to even start operating within the copy principle. No, the shade is arrived at through the operations allowable within Hume's copy principle, and is merely an unusual example of a posteriori knowledge. So no, Kant, this isn't where you can sneak in. Put that synthetic a priori back in your pocket. This argument may not be fully conclusive, as I haven't outlined a direct proof that the example is a valid result from Hume's copy principle operations, but it's at least a step in the right direction, and is certainly better than just admitting you're wrong and minimizing the danger. In fact, if true, this actually expands Hume's copy principle by allowing for slightly more flexibility. How can we avoid Hume's mistake in our own thinking? Hume's willingness to engage with potential objections is genuinely admirable and honest, but his confrontation with this specific one shows that we can't do this lightly. When faced with competing evidence to our own thoughts, it's absolutely necessary, if we value truth, to think through the evidence exhaustively, rather than just naively minimize it or ignore it reactively. How damaging is this counterexample? Can we amend our position to include it? Is it even a true counterexample? These questions must be engaged with meaningfully, and maybe if you had done this, I wouldn't have even been able to make this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like stuff like this, I would heavily encourage a subscription, a comment, and a like. Have a nice day.